Okay, great. Always nice to see that video. Also funny to see myself with my COVID haircut, or should I say lack of a haircut in that video. Very, very welcome to another episode of FSR Insights. My colleagues were very kind to me to remind me that it's the last one of this season, not only FSR Insights, but all the online events we do on Wednesdays. Of course, we will come back with the third season in September. And yeah, let's also close this one very nicely. Another thing to mention is that I'm normally co-hosting this event with Lucilla, but Lucilla had very good news. She's on maternity leave, and that's why I will be also very happy to see her back in September. But today I'm alone, not fully alone. Luckily, I have two professors with me that will take up the role as discussants. We have Anna Creti, professor at Paris Dauphine, in France, and we have Marten, who is professor at Ghent University in Belgium. Both of them are energy economists, and that's why it's great that they're here to give some feedback to Martin's research and to just also have a discussion on the topics Martin will introduce. And you will see that he actually has three subtopics that he will introduce, and he will also launch a poll to see what the audience thinks here before we ask our discussants what they think. He will talk about price volatility, hot topic today, right? But he won't talk about it in the current context. He will talk about it in the future context, that we will have a fully decarbonized energy system, and to what extent should we be concerned about price volatility in a system like that. Second subtopic he will treat is seasonal storage, and the third one will be about shocks. So, Martin, you have the floor. Please introduce us to the topics, and then you can start launching one discussion after the other. Go ahead. You still have to unmute, Martin.
There we go. Sorry about that. So thank you for the introduction, Leo, and the invitation to be here today. Good afternoon, everyone. As Leo said, today I'll be presenting my latest research, revisiting policy concerns in decarbonized energy systems, price volatility, seasonal storage, and shocks. So I'd like to start by presenting the motivation for this research and introducing key elements to contextualize each policy concern. And from there, I'll mention a few aspects about the modeling, and then we'll move directly to some polls and discussion. So the motivation begins with the objective of climate neutrality by 2050 and how we're going to get there. So the European Commission conducted some research before the European climate law was passed, and multiple decarbonization pathways were envisioned, which place a particular emphasis on certain technologies and societal changes. Some of which describe an important role for sectoral integration via hydrogen and synthetic fuels. So as you can see, the energy transformation involves multiple energy carriers and not only the electricity sector. And across scenarios, variable renewable energy like wind and solar will massively contribute to decarbonize the energy system. And this significantly impacts the functioning of energy markets and brings forward three inextricable policy concerns. And as the title of this work indicates, these concerns are not new to the academic literature. So one longstanding policy concern is price volatility. So as Leo said, while today's price volatility is mainly due to increasing gas commodity prices, looking toward the future, another source of price volatility is what has been referred to as the merit order effect in electricity markets. So as more renewables are deployed, they displace mid-merit thermal generators with higher marginal costs and depress wholesale electricity prices in some hours. So this makes it more difficult for renewables to recover their investment costs. And at the same time, thermal generators may still be needed to meet peak residual load. So when renewables are generating at their minimum, and therefore thermal generators may need to recover their investment costs in fewer hours. So this can widen price spreads. So as I've listed here, there's a range of technological solutions that have been proposed in the academic literature, including different types of flexibility like demand-side management, battery storage, and load curtailment. And in highly decarbonized energy systems, the academic literature puts forward increased sector coupling and multiple types of energy storage. So the first research question associated with this policy concern, and soon you'll be able to give your opinion on this question, is will price volatility in decarbonized energy systems increase due to renewables? Now, a second related policy concern is seasonal storage. And the research question is, even if battery storage is cheap, will we need other types of seasonal energy storage to meet climate neutrality objectives? So MIT recently released their Future of Energy Storage report, which looks at the role of different energy storage technologies to meet highly decarbonized scenarios in 3 American regions. And they classify 3 groups of electricity storage technologies based on power and energy capacity costs. So for example, here, hydrogen would be considered seasonal, meaning low energy capacity costs, but high power capacity costs. Flow batteries would be considered as long duration and lithium ion as short duration. So the requirements of the energy system in terms of power and capacity and these cost characteristics will drive technology adoption. In the academic literature, models do not always include a range of energy storage solutions, or an energy system model perspective is not always taken. And on a related note, in moving towards a highly decarbonized energy system, which heavily relies on renewables and storage, to what extent are there risks of shocks? So on the left, you'll see that there are a range of possible future shocks in the minds of policymakers. And energy is just one of many, right? So shocks may originate due to geopolitical, economic, and natural events, and are likely to create policy responses. And when it comes to modeling shocks, the optimal solution in the face of a shock may not necessarily be aligned with the optimal solution from a least cost minimization approach, as Namaker et al. Illustrate. But a least cost minimization approach is often applied when analyzing the future evolution of energy prices. So somewhat painting an incomplete picture. The one type of shock we will discuss in this work is related to extreme weather, and more specifically, a tail risk, low renewable generation, Dunkelflaute type event. So which brings us to the third research question. To deal with this type of shock, which situation is preferred, being underprepared or overprepared? Now, before I get to the first poll, I briefly want to mention how we obtain our results, which is what I will share with you after each poll. So without going into great detail, we advance a stylized energy system model comprised of energy supply, conversion, and storage technologies, which meet a final electricity, hydrogen, and heat demand, which is what you see here. And we conduct a numerical case study, partly based on Belgium, using a single reference year. Now, the objective of a stylized model is to derive insights and relationships. So bear this in mind that not all representative technologies or pathways are included. And also that this integrated energy market model takes a greenfield approach, meaning there's no existing capacity is assumed. And there's also we don't consider network costs or constraints. So in this work, we analyzed the role of conversion technologies like power to hydrogen and energy storage technologies in shaping the future evolution of energy prices. But the caveat is the energy system faces an extended 2-week low renewable generation events. So now that you know a bit about the motivation and the methodology, let's launch the first poll. So now the first poll is about price volatility. So will price volatility in decarbonized energy systems be greater than today due to variable renewable energy? And so here are some contrasting findings from the academic literature. Hartel and Corpus find that there will not be too many zero or even negative price situations due to surplus renewables, thanks to the cross-sectoral interactions that from decarbonizing heat and industry and transport. And then the MIT recent Future of Energy Storage report, they find that due to increasing renewables, that there will be many hours of very low prices and only few hours with very high prices, approaching value of lost load. So give everyone a moment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Martin, to introduce the first poll. And we see the results here with a big majority voting yes. And when we asked the same question on Twitter, I think the audience was more divided, right? So, but it's a very interesting result. And Okay, so maybe you still share your thoughts about the topic, and then we'll ask our panelists what they think. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, and maybe since we framed the question as compared to today, that may have affected your view to some extent. So we have a few insights to unpack based on the modeling results. So in the first part of this work, we compute the long-term equilibrium with perfect foresight. Now, this is a common approach in which market agents can adapt their investment and operational decisions in response to hourly market prices. So they take into account their annualized investment and variable costs. So, and in this model, we have a cross-sectoral CO2 emissions reduction target. And from this policy constraint, a CO2 price emerges. And so what we've done here is we've calculated the weighted average price of energy. And in the aggregate terms, there doesn't seem to be a major problem. You'll see that there's a more than doubling of the CO2 price between the 65% to 95% CO2 target. However, the average price only increases by 14% in the case of electricity and 22% in the case of heat. So to investigate price volatility and to what extent the merit order effect is a concern, you must look at the distribution of prices. So here I show the distribution of electricity prices for the same CO2 target scenarios. And so this chart shows how frequent electricity prices are in a certain range over the entire reference year. And I want to highlight two things that show price volatility is moderated. So first, you'll notice that there are no extreme prices, meaning value of lost load at the price of 10,000 euros per megawatt hour. So this is because market agents can perfectly anticipate the low renewable generation event and adapt their decisions accordingly. This also means that there are more cost competitive options than low curtailment. Second, you would expect that at increasingly higher CO2 targets that there will be more spillage of renewables, and at which the price of electricity would be 0 euros per megawatt hour. But instead, you'll notice that the prices in the 0 to 5 euro per megawatt hour range are stable at 10% across these scenarios. So what explains this? Well, some technologies can operate as a flexible load, like power to hydrogen, electric heat pumps, and energy storage, which reduces spillage of renewables and smoothens supply and demand. And at the same time, power to hydrogen plays a particularly important price setting role in the electricity market. So that's based on the arbitrage opportunity to convert electricity and sell hydrogen. So in setting a non-zero price, power to hydrogen stabilizes electricity prices and counteracts the merit order effect. So in the paper, which is in more detail, we show that in the absence of power to hydrogen, price spreads widen and there's more price volatility. So overall, to answer the question, cross-sectoral interactions and energy storage can mitigate the merit order effect, which is a source of price volatility. So we find that consistent with other academics, maybe that if sector coupling is insufficiently developed, then the merit order effect may not be fully counteracted. So let me stop sharing my screen for a moment.
Great. Thank you, Martin. So, dear panelists, how would you have voted? And any thoughts on what Martin just presented? Who wants to go first? Anna, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Leonardo and Martin, for having me making these few reactions. The panelists couldn't vote, but if I could, I would have said that maybe no, the volatility is not going to increase, and for the reasons that somehow Martin has shown. My question is related to the context and the results of the model that you have. Can you somehow disentangle the importance of the mix that you have characterized with respect to the results? Because even if it is a model that is greenfield and it is supposed to not to be dependent, let's say, on the past, still you have calibrated something on the Belgian side. So it would be nice to understand also a little bit more the relative importance of different technologies. And as a second effect, I think that in your model, the variability effect and the merit order effect are interlinked. And this very much depends on this question about the mix. And in my experience, so I have studied in another market, which is the Italian one. It is not 100% sure that renewables are going to be at zero. And I know that this is one of the assumptions that it is important in your model. So if you can just clarify on one side the importance of the mix that you have considered, and on the other side also the importance of the bidding behavior that is behind your simulations.
Yes, I'm happy to clarify some of those components, especially of the energy mix, because as a country like Belgium, very limited hydro capacity, for instance, or like it's not like the case of France. So there are some assumptions in terms of what are the underlying technologies that we include. So it is a stylized model. So I remember when I started working on this, discussion about nuclear was already a close case in Belgium, and that's since changed. So we also don't have nuclear in our mix, for instance. But yeah, so it is kind of a gas and renewables dominated system. So you have gas, which is supplying your heat demand, your power demand, and your industrial demand for hydrogen, right? So so that is kind of the way that this model is set up. And then you kind of have the complementary side of variable renewables that through conversion technologies like heat pumps and power to hydrogen, and just directly supporting the electricity sector via battery storage, that's how this is all, that's how the demand supply balance is met. And so it is a stylized model in the sense that it's kind of just looking at the case of Belgium. As I said earlier, some of the other technological solutions that were put forward also include interconnections and such, and that's also not included in this model. So there's other types of flexibility that we don't necessarily look at, but low curtailment is one of them as well. So low curtailment at the value of lost load is also an option. Moving on to the second question about, so yeah, the looking forward is like how, there's not going to be many hours where the price is zero, or and where does that come from? So I want to disentangle two things, because there's when there's spillage, the price is zero. But you can also, something that we don't capture in this model would be, you have, sort of startup and shutdown constraints of generators, and that could allow, that could drive negative prices, right? So that's something that we also don't capture in the model. But how is it that when there is spillage, or that when renewables are being evacuated by other technologies, that the price isn't zero? And that's because multiple technologies are competing for this renewables. So whether it's converting to hydrogen or shifting it to another to a subsequent period. And so between the competition between storage and conversion, that's how the non-zero price manifests, right? But if there is spillage, then the price would still be zero, which happens in exceptionally few hours.
And also just a comment before leaving the floor to Martin. On the demand side, you make some specific assumption with respect to you have cited the question of demand side management or so. So is there any structural change that you have perhaps also simulated in your model?
So it's an excellent question. Thank you. Yeah, going back to I think that would be a nice kind of sensitivity to do, and it kind of reflects back to what was the first showing the different decarbonization pathways of the European Commission, for instance. If you place another additional emphasis on energy efficiency, perhaps that's another route to reduce energy demand, and then that would also change the amount of capacities that you would need, whether it's battery storage or other. So that is a nice idea. I think that'd be a nice addition to the paper. But in terms of running different scenarios of demand on the demand side, we haven't really done that. But as you can imagine, since we also didn't include like the transport sector, for instance, that would also play quite a role in this story when you think about electric vehicles or heavy transport, maybe moving to hydrogen and such. So that's another part of something that's maybe not captured. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Anna. And everyone else, also do not hesitate to put questions in the Q&A box or in the chat as you prefer. And meanwhile, we go to Martin. Martin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Leo, and thank you, Martin, for the presentation. in a way, the question is, I would say, a tricky question to answer because it depends on the ifs. So I could answer both yes and no, I would say. But interestingly, your model, I would say, provides a benchmark of comparing the questions, or the yes and the no, because it's a green field. It's up to investment in all technologies, not only electricity, but also the other sectors, hydrogen, methane. And so what you essentially show is that you can mitigate some of the increased volatility that are there because of the inflow of variable renewables if you do it well. But I think the more interesting research question is the way towards 2050, not 2050 itself. So that means, what if we have imperfect investment in these other sectoral technologies? So comparing your benchmark, the one that you show, let's say not that much difference between 65, 95% decrease of CO2 emissions. What if there's not enough hydrogen or methane capacity, both capacity and energy value left or yet installed? So what are the bounds on volatility? Will it really explode? Those kind of things are useful, I would say, for today, or let's say the 10 next years.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thought as well, because also when we run this optimization, it's kind of single shots to reach this kind of final point, but you also need to realize that you're like, really there should be more of an intertemporal situation of how to get to 2050, right? And there are certain different cost competitiveness changes between now and then, due to here in this model we assume, for instance, 2050 technology costs. But getting to the point, I think that maybe when we get later on into the presentation, when I talk about what is the impact of imperfect investments, and you can kind of see when you don't act or when you get it wrong, then what happens. So yeah, maybe the point would be then to consider different types of imperfect foresight, really, instead of maybe one, which is what we'll show at least one in this presentation today. So thank you for the question. Very interesting.
Okay, great. I think I'm trying to keep the time. So I think we're 1/3 into the webinar. So let's move to the second topic. So we try to spend equal time on each of the 3 subtopics. Go ahead, Martin.
Okay. Am I muted? No. Okay. Second poll is on seasonal energy storage. So even if battery storage is cheap, will we need seasonal energy storage to meet climate neutrality objectives? So for this question, it's also assumed that you've already tapped out the hydro storage potential, which could also be a type of seasonal storage. And so here's some contrasting views from the literature. So you have the MIT Future of Energy Storage study, which finds that hydrogen can play a unique role to decarbonize other end uses and act as a flexible load to integrate renewables. And then Koirala et al. Find that hydrogen and methane storage play a key role in balancing the seasonal variation of demand and supply. So here are some potential aspects to consider when in your poll.
Okay, and we see the second poll already appearing. So will we have a full battery solution or something more needed for storage? Oh, again, yeah, so almost nobody thinks that batteries are enough. Martin, what do you think?
Quite overwhelming. Okay, so yeah, when it comes to our results, we observe a role for renewable gases not only to decarbonize end uses, but also to provide seasonal energy storage. So with our model, we conduct a sensitivity analysis to see whether the need for seasonal storage may be dampened by cheaper battery storage. So battery capacity costs are reduced by 25% in 2 separate CO2 scenarios, a 65% and a 95% CO2 target. And here you see the installed capacities for a subset of technologies. So you have renewables, but also gas generators, powered hydrogen, methanation, and then we have battery, hydrogen, and methane storage, but expressed in both power and capacity terms. So in the 65% CO2 target scenario, A reduction in battery costs simply makes renewables and battery storage more cost competitive compared to alternative decarbonization options, whether it's renewable powered hydrogen or renewable heat. Whereas in the 95% CO2 target scenario, we clearly see seasonal energy storage plays a role. So at 95%, the full pathway power to methane to power occurs. So you have power to hydrogen is operated as a flexible electricity load. Hydrogen storage is used as a buffer to continuously feed the methanation process. And then this renewable methane can subsequently be used in gas generators for power or gas boilers for heat. Although keep in mind that this only represents a very small percentage of total demand. And then methane storage capacity is quite significant because it's only needed in a limited number of periods. And so when you carry out the sensitivity on battery costs in the 95% scenario, there's relatively no change in hydrogen or methane storage capacity. And you actually see an increase in battery storage and a reduction in renewables. So seasonal storage seems to be indispensable, but how do you really explain this? Well, first and foremost, the low renewable generation event requires significant energy storage capacity, so hydrogen is favored for its cost structure. And second, at very high CO2 targets, adding more renewables may lead to more hours with a zero electricity price, and then battery storage arbitrage may need to happen over larger time spans. So to answer the question, a low renewable generation event may increase the need for seasonal storage. Stop there.
Thank you, Martin. Martin, let's start with you this time.
Yes, this was less of a tricky question to me and also to the audience, apparently. And I think the reason is that the role of hydrogen in Europe right now. So it was perceived to be like this storage device, let's say when I started my PhD. But right now, if you look at the hydrogen strategy of Europe, this is second order. It's really all about decarbonizing the industry. Hydrogen will be one of the main roads towards decarbonizing big industrial processes, aluminum production, chemical industry, steel, those kind of things. And I think the fact that we can get it from renewables and that you can use it as a big battery is second order. And that's somewhat what I was missing in your model, the whole connection to the industry and the demands to decarbonize the industry. That's first. And then second, methane, that was a more difficult one to me, because if you look just at the technological side, like the efficiency of the cycle, electrons to methane back to electrons, it's not that favorable. So many people are less convinced of that cycle. So it's a bit more contentious, I think, to do this. And I still don't know yet. I haven't seen the conclusive evidence yet. So that's an invitation to anyone writing papers convincing me of what to do with methane. Use it in the industry or use it for gas plants in electricity. And my idea is the first, use it in the industry and not use it in the power industry, but I'm open to being convinced.
Thank you, Martin. So, Martin.
Yeah, so within our scenarios, obviously, it doesn't become really a feasible thing to, well, I shouldn't say feasible. You really don't get to this kind of power to methane to power until you really have exhausted all your hydrogen demand. That's kind of what happens in this particular model. And then also when you're kind of looking at the full pathway, this is really, the dispatchable gas generators are really playing a role as a backup to deal with this low renewable generation event. We also did run a sensitivity where we remove just the methanation part. And so then you really have just hydrogen storage, and then you can have hydrogen using gas-fired turbines. And so there you still have the same need for seasonal storage, but you don't necessarily, so it becomes, you really have to go down to the granularity as well about looking into the spatial components and then really the network, which is something we don't necessarily touch on. Yeah, so that's, so thank you for the question. It's very interesting.
But you are confirming Martin's belief that it first goes to the industry demand, even though that you've not characterized all the specific industries. You have a hydrogen demand, right? That is met first.
Yes.
And then only marginally you have that methanation. Huh?
Yeah, it's a percentage of total of all the renewable energy. Like if you look at the renewable energy share, let's say, the part that's served by, in this 95% scenario, the part that's served by gas generation is something like 3% of all renewable energy. So it's a very small amount as well. So it is really of a backup in that sense.
A very small amount that seems to be cheaper than batteries or any other option that would be available, right? That's what I understood. Okay, Anna, please.
Yes, here comes an aspect that I really appreciate in your research, Martin, is that you unveil the fact that when we think about storage technology, we have something that is much more heterogeneous than what we can think about. So we always have in mind something that is perhaps driven by gas, and we say, well, storage is just a unique technology that displaces the load, the quantities from one period to the other. But as you are showing us, also the specificities and the cost and the characteristics of different technologies matters. So on this regard, I was wondering whether we can interpret somehow the results that you're delivering as a diversification effect. So imagine that storage is a portfolio of different technologies, and what you are illustrating is like the effect of integrating or not one of these technologies, really like in a portfolio, depending on, especially on the variability. And then depending on the cost characteristics, you show that some technologies are more suited to be integrated in the merit order effect than others. So which comes also to my next question, whether in your approach, you could exactly show this diversification effect and the complementarity with the other technologies in a more explicit way.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. It's a very good point, and I think that is something I try to do with this research, is really say that we should always be taking a kind of an energy system perspective, because that's how we're going to get to 2050. And then in terms, I think I do try to go into quite detail in the paper that that battery storage is kind of complementary, I would even say, to some extent, in terms of the price setting in electricity markets. So you have batteries which are smoothening, actually consuming when both powered hydrogen and batteries are consuming at the same time. And then they're also setting the price later on in subsequent periods. So they're together creating this sort of setup where they're setting a non-zero price together. But then they might be competing to some extent because there's a limit in there's scarce renewables, right? But all in all, they kind of do complement one another. In terms of like a diversification strategy, I think in the end we're kind of still looking for what is the least cost route to decarbonization, and that should be really taken into account. So whether that fits into eventually you have too much renewables, so you should be focusing more on hydrogen, or vice versa. I think there's kind of a pathway of getting there, but it's still going to be cost driven, and the cost structures of these storage technologies are quite important when taken together.
Yes, because also something that is interesting and that differs from the traditional storage. Again, I make reference to what we have in mind when with gas, is that electricity storage is not only smoothing the quantities, but also avoiding the waste of electricity production. And this is something that I think we have to analyze a little bit further, because it is the specificity of how this technology can be integrated in the electricity mix.
Yes, I think that even segues nice into the next part as well, because if you think about it, say you are at some point getting a value, you're ever going to reach a value of lost load. What is the value of that spilled electricity then? So that's all. It's a nice segue to the next question.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin. Maybe before we go to the next question, we also still pick up a question from the Q&A box, because we have Florian that asks, what is the contribution of demand-side flexibility, like EV heat pumps, in the model? The extent of their contribution is still a major uncertainty, no? So can you maybe share what you think about that?
Yes, as I mentioned a bit earlier, so we looked at electricity, heat, and hydrogen demand, but mainly from the sense of hydrogen for industry. We didn't really look at the hydrogen for transport, and we didn't look at really the transport sector yet. So I can only speculate on that part at this point. But that could play make another. Could be an additional type of demand for the electricity sector. And then, that's why we tried to capture a bit with our sensitivity of the battery storage costs, because, if we are going to have widespread EVs everywhere, then they're also going to be able to provide quite a bit of flexibility. So, yeah, whether or not we get there, I think, when you look at what is the most, if you look at the European Commission's smart sectoral integration strategy, the process is energy efficiency first, then electrify as much as you can, and then decarbonize, with hard to debate sectors with hydrogen, so or other synthetic fuels. So I think we're going to push EVs and electrification as much as we can. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Martin. Florian will tell us if he has a follow-up question or not. But maybe, Martin, can we come back to you? Are you a bit more convinced now? Or are you, because I had the impression you were more thinking of from a levelized cost and efficiency point of view. You were skeptical, right, that this kind of technologies with methanation would pick up. But what if you take a portfolio point of view like Anna did? Are you a bit more convinced, or?
No, I think what is missing in the portfolio of CCS, the fact that you can use CCS on gas plants will, I guess, always be cheaper than the round trip of methane, using the methane in gas plants. And also one of the reasons is that those methane molecules can then be used to go towards synthetic fuels, e-fuels in aviation and shipping, which will be more valuable, I guess, than even high price times in power, because you have CCS, which will dampen the highest prices. So that's my view. And that's missing in the model also, CCS.
Yeah,
so
good point,
reasons, I think.
Martin. Is that still another sensitivity to add, CCS?
Indeed. I think that it's a nice point. We don't really. I think that would bring a nicely additional dimension to our work, carrying out that kind of sensitivity. Because kind of at this point we assume one specific methane price or import price, and yeah, what are you're going to be looking at cost parity between green or blue or gray, between green, blue, and gray hydrogen. So. Yeah, it's an interesting thought, this carbon capture and storage, and also it has, it also has a sort of network requirements, network dimension to it. Yeah, it's something we'll have to look at further. I can only speculate at this time, but it's true that seems to be a part of the portfolio of options on the road to decarbonization.
It's a difficult question. Once you go towards sector coupling, you open up a very difficult to deal with world.
Yeah, but you can still say that at least since you have to somehow respect the boundaries of the exercise that focuses really on the electricity system. What you show here is kind of an opportunity cost, in the sense that this is one of the options that we have, one of the values perhaps of methane. And as you were saying, Martin, the same methane can be also used in other supply chains. And this is part also of the choices that we have to make if we want to fit with the carbon neutrality, that is, which is the least a cost or more interesting in terms of profitability technologies that we want to push on specific usages. And still, I think that this kind of analysis doesn't exist. So we have to be a little bit more detailed. Once we have to come up with not roadmap, but real investment, how much we have to invest in CCS compared to power to gas. And this kind of analysis is showing that what can be one of the possible effects if we deploy this technology.
Or if we are really stuck with CCS, what is then the consequence? Yeah. So it's all about how you frame the research indeed. And indeed, I think Martin said also at the beginning, it's not about forecasting the future, it's more about if these set of technologies are combined, how do they complement or compete, right? That's maybe the way to look at it. Okay, Martin, then we are exactly in 2/3 of the event. So now I'm giving you back the floor to introduce the third subtopic. Go ahead. And unmute, of course.
Muted myself. Yeah. So the third poll is about shocks to the energy system. So most models assume perfect foresight, and this has important implications for energy systems with significant shares of renewables and a low renewable generation type event. So which situation is preferred to deal with such a shock, being underprepared or overprepared? And so how should one think about this question? Well, I'll frame it using what's been said in the academic literature. So if insufficient energy storage is deployed, then you may find yourself underprepared to deal with a shock. So Gesk and Green question whether an energy-only market, which relies on high peak prices, can give the right incentives for storage. So you may find yourself in this underprepared situation. While Runau and Quiz find that storage requirements are significantly underestimated when system planning is based on average years. So if instead system planning of storage requirements is designed to meet the worst tail risk event, then you may find yourself overprepared during an average year.
Great, thanks, Martin. Meanwhile, the poll has been launched. Tick, tick, tick. A few more seconds to answer. Okay, this time, well, we always have one option that is really popular. So this time, everybody prefers us to be overprepared. Maybe that's also due to the current context we are in, probably. All of a sudden, we are not so worried anymore about overprepared, but rather the opposite. Okay. Martin, tell us, what do you think based on your simulation?
Yeah, so in the end, why does this matter? Well, both situation drive and evolution energy market prices, which could cause potential market interventions from policymakers. And, you know, as we said, it kind of has some sort of relation to today. So using the same chart as before, this shows electricity market clearing prices for a 95% CO2 target in two equilibrium settings. So in a long-term equilibrium setting, which we've already looked at, market agents can adjust investment and operational decisions. So irrespective of the duration of the event, whether 2 days or 2 weeks, prices remain stable. You do not see extremely high prices at value lost loads, nor do you see significant number of periods with zero electricity prices. But if you agree that perfect foresight is not always achievable, what else could happen? So to simulate a short-term equilibrium shock, we assume market agents have imperfect foresight. So the model is solved in 2 steps. First, market agents make investment decisions based on the view that a 2-day or 2-week low renewable generation event will occur. Second, the opposite occurs, and only operational decisions can then be adapted. So you have 2 illustrative scenarios in which the energy system is inadequately prepared for the type of low renewable generation event. There's a mismatch. So in the overprepared scenario, investments in renewables, gas generators, power to hydrogen, and hydrogen storage exceed what is necessary to meet energy demand and the CO2 target. So the result is electricity prices are depressed. And so the drawback of being overprepared is that market agents may not be able to recover their investment costs. Now, if revenue adequacy is a concern, then possible market interventions could be providing additional support to offset these losses, which may also be difficult to implement. In the underprepared scenario, the installed capacities cannot provide adequate CO2-free renewable energy, nor meet the peak residual electricity demand. So the drawback of being underprepared is that load curtailment at the value of lost load is the only viable option in some periods. And this kind of spreads to other periods due to the interaction through power to hydrogen, but also through battery storage. So the result is extreme prices prevail. And in this case, market agents make windfall profits. So a possible market intervention could be a clawback of profits from market agents, which also may be difficult to implement. So these are two simple and illustrative preparedness scenarios, while the plausible reality will be somewhere in the middle. And in the end, to answer the question, the political acceptance of the market interventions for ending up in either situation is likely to steer the preference of policymakers. Another middle ground market intervention could be the design of a market mechanism where renewable energy could be stored and maintained aside precautionarily for the energy system in the event of this type of event. So that's...
Thank you, Martin. So our discussants could comment on how you would have voted, but maybe also in what type of situation do you think policymakers prefer to be, right? Because in each case, you have some policy measures that can try to remedy the situation, but they are very different in nature. So lots you can comment on. Anna, do you want to start?
Yes, I had also preliminary remark and question on can you give us more precise definition of preparedness? Because I think that somehow this is also key to understand your result and maybe to give some further comments. And you're right, Leonardo, I think that in the current situation, preparedness means perhaps anticipating and finding a strategy, but not sure that this is what Martin says in his research.
Yeah, so to give some context, the idea of being, so it's kind of your perspective on how long do you think this Dunkelflaute type event could be. So I use as a illustration that it's 2 weeks in duration, whereas one of the papers that I cite, they say that it can actually span 3 months where Dunkelflautes happen sequentially, one after another. So the type of kind of energy capacity and type of preparedness might be different than if you were optimizing for a single reference year, which happens to be often the approach applied, or sometimes there's some sort of representative days where you perhaps don't capture all the details of different storage, the portfolio of storage technology. So that's those are both active areas of research. So what we show in this paper is that, getting it wrong, depending on how well you're prepared in terms of energy storage capacity, which is renewable, which is CO2 free, how this can kind of buffer you for this type of event. And so the question is whether decentralized market agents, given an energy only market, whether they can make these type of investments and and I think you have to really go further because we can't answer that question because you really have to look at the risk profiles of the different market agents, which is something that has been done already, as active when you look at capacity mechanisms, for instance. So I think that kind of gives you an idea of what being underprepared for that type of situation. I guess overprepared is a bit more difficult to describe, right? It depends on how prepared for which worst case, for over how many, extreme weather is getting worse and worse. So maybe that's also a question. What is the worst case scenario or the tail risk that you want to avoid?
Yes, because maybe another way to illustrate the same result is also to look at this investment in renewables like an insurance policy, and really saying compare the cost of this insurance policy with the value of lost load that is back in the question, and then say preparedness is to minimize this idea of the gap between the cost of this insurance policy and the cost on the value of lost load. Then maybe you can convey more easily also the idea of which is the driver of the effect that you are analyzing.
Martin, you still want to comment, or you just take the advice, which is okay. No, but it's true, huh? But that would lead to another paper, I think, right?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I kind of said earlier, that what is the value of that renewable energy or making these investments if you're going to hit value loss load. And then you really have to determine whether the market on its own is going to make these investments or not. And then you really have to look at, is there some sort of market failure due to asymmetric risks or what have you? And then you're really talking about insurance policies. So yeah, indeed, I think, but I think there are different types of preparedness that you could look at. I think these are just two simple illustrative ones to bring this out into the open, kind of a.
What I also learned from your simulations, Martin, is that we are used to think of resource adequacy in terms of, I don't know, will we have enough investment in gas power plants, right? Because if there is somebody asking for a capacity mechanisms, it used to be traditionally that type of technologies or investments. But in your simulations, you see that the storage technologies are even more risky in terms of having to recover all their fixed costs or investment costs in fewer hours of extreme prices, right? So they are even more exposed to this kind of revenue risk.
Yeah, it's really moving from just an electricity sector only kind of perspective to broadening the scope of this sort of resource adequacy in a energy system paradigm, let's say. And then there are different technologies, you could say, with revenue at risk or revenue adequacy concerns, indeed.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Anna, you still wanted to comment before we go?
Yeah, just a question, because really on the practical side, if you ask the same question to practitioners and investors, what they say today is that they are willing to invest in these technologies because they foresee that the cost of the situations where they are, in your terms, not prepared will be extremely high. So in the perspective of today, when these technologies are not yet operational, it seems that there is some willingness to invest. But the question is whether, as you were asking, whether the market is giving a lot of incentives. So my point of view is that actually the investors are not asking this question the same way. They do not think that they will wait for the price to be that or this or that. It's just they have the fear to somehow that the system is going to collapse.
Yes, there is a question whether, I mean, it was already complex enough, right? When you just think of the electricity market and why we ended up with maybe some capacity mechanism. Now you add the sectoral integration part of it, and the predictability maybe of future prices is even more complicated or more complex. So yeah, it brings an extra layer of complexity to the investment decision, indeed.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, Marten?
Yeah, first of all, I like this part of the research most. I really like this because so you show that prices are sensitive to like imperfectly anticipating or imperfect foresight about shocks. So in this case, it's the length of VRE period or low VRE period. And of course, it's an illustration, so it's very magnified, the effects in your case. And so I was wondering, I think it's a nice research agenda to look more into future work, the sensitivity of prices and like revenues of different technologies, different seasonal storage technologies in response to different types of shocks, and not just this one, but other types of shocks in a more real life setting. I think it will be very nice to get an idea of the uncertainty that there will be in response to different types of shocks. And of course, right now, because of the sustained high prices that we see in the electricity market, there is a lot of a discussion about electricity market design and how can we mitigate the volatility. And what that is interesting is to what extent different levels of storage can actually mitigate or even magnify shocks happening. That's so you start looking into this, but I think there's much more you can do.
Indeed, in the one of the references I mentioned early on, it's kind of you're maybe not only optimizing for one shock, but different shocks happening at the same time, and so that system's going to look much different than maybe just your least cost minimization type of model. And indeed, we don't really look at that for the fossil methane sensitivity price, but I think that would add another layer, or different types of unavailability perhaps of certain things, more due to climate type risks. So I think that's a really nice future type of research, or maybe an extra sensitivity for this work.
Yeah, and I would definitely look also into how the availability of different storage technologies affect this, because that's essentially the title of your paper, the interconnection between those three. But in this part of the research, it's not yet interconnected. So the availability of having hydrogen or not storage, methane or not storage, on balancing or magnifying. It might be the case that it magnifies shocks.
Comparing in the absence of one or the other, because it kind of like I did in the second part of the paper with powered hydrogen, that'd be a very interesting line of inquiry as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me then just read out a few additional questions we got, and then you can, all three of you can pick up and react if you like. So we have Vikram, who is related still to the previous poll question, was thinking about, can we evaluate the contribution of incremental storage capacity to reliability? Maybe it links a bit to what Martin was just saying, right? So the trade-off against the cost of incremental storage capacity and reliability, right? So, and should we, for that, prefer to be over or underprepared? And then we have Tim, who's also connecting to the over and underprepared scenarios, and is asking, is this really an issue if hedging would be perfect? So he wants to know when will this become a real issue? Is when we will be doing rolling blackouts because we are underprepared, or does overprepared issue have similar drawbacks? So yeah, how dramatic is the is the overprepared scenario? Yeah, I think I said enough. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that looking at let's say the kind of the marginal or incremental contribution, or contribution to reliability and putting that in cost terms, that's not something yet that we've done. But yeah, that actually does sound quite interesting, because maybe there are some trade-offs, or there's something to really bring forward of what those trade-offs are between the different storage technologies. So I can only speculate at this point what that would be. And then in terms of and looking at whether or not there has to be liquid trading to also deal with price volatility. Here we kind of looked at this kind of Dunkelflaute event, but there is some sort of let's say the risk between day ahead and time of gate closure, so that there also has to be kind of a liquid market there, which can probably maybe also moderate some of this volatility. So these scenarios are more illustrative. So I'm not sure. Exactly. I mean, there's different ranges. Like also looking at overprepared or underprepared at different CO2 targets could also be done. Maybe that's something else I could show in this work. So thank you for the questions.
But I think in the overprepared scenario, the only thing that is problematic there is that some people are not earning back their investment costs, right? So
indeed.
That's the drama that takes place there, right?
Yeah, if you have more renewables in storage, then you kind of have less. It depresses the electricity prices. and that's kind of to the detriment of all the market participants. So then you're really looking at a revenue adequacy concern.
Yeah. Okay, we're exactly on time. So I can just finish by thanking you all. It has been great. And also, you know, we had lots of participants here today, and lots joined the whole season here. 1,404 participants this season. Very proud of that. And I hope to see some of you back also in September. And that gives us some time between now and September to think of how we will further experiment and what new formats we might try out. But I definitely liked this format with the three of you. Thank you again.